Hi, I'm Dan Edwards. I'm the author of Billy the Kid, an autobiography, the story of Brushy Bill Roberts. On the surface, the evidence that Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid in Fort Sumner on July 14, 1881 is very compelling. He had a coroner's jury signed by 7 people. He got the reward money from the state of New Mexico. And there were also supposedly dozens of witnesses that knew Billy the Kid, that saw the body, that put him in the grave. And so when you hear that, it's very normal to say, sure, Pat Garrett killed him. However, when you look at the primary evidence and you look at the firsthand testimonies of the people that actually were there, it's a completely different story. So for one, Pat Garrett, when he submitted the coroner's jury was rejected and he didn't get the reward money. Later, when Garrett's attorney went to the legislature to try to get the reward approved, he didn't submit the coroner's jury as evidence. And this is why whenever the legislature finally got around a year later to approving the reward money for Garrett, it said that Billy the Kid had been killed by the hand of Pat Garrett on or about August of 1881. Not July 14th, not July anything, but August. So you have the legislature of the state of New Mexico saying, yeah, he killed him sometime about August, when the coroner's jury report very clearly says July 14th, 1881. That would be like the Warren Commission saying that President John F. Kennedy was killed on or about December of 1963. It just doesn't make any sense when the only piece of evidence that supposedly supports the claim is a single piece of paper that's 2 paragraphs long that very clearly says the date. Now, a lot of people, including people that were there that night, said that Pat Garrett wrote that coroner's jury himself, and he had hand-picked people that didn't even see the body that signed the piece of paper. So that's the first part, is that the coroner's jury is complete bunk. We don't have a copy. There is a supposedly photocopy that's been analyzed, and they say that the handwriting is fake. These aren't real signatures. You can see that the same person wrote the different signatures of the different people. It's written in Spanish. Pat Garrett, who didn't speak Spanish, had 2 white deputies with him. He didn't get any statement from those deputies. He didn't get any statement from the big landowner who owned the house where Billy the Kid was supposedly killed. He didn't get his statement. And if you think about it, this coroner's jury statement in Spanish means that his 2 deputies can't read what it says. So they had no idea what it said, and yet he's submitting this as evidence. It was just a very shoddy job on behalf of Pat Garrett, and it certainly does not constitute proof that he killed Billy the Kid. The second thing you have to consider when you look at the night of July 14th, 1881, when Pat Garrett supposedly killed Billy the Kid, are the testimonies of the people that say they were there. And if you take the time to go through each and every testimony, you have a lot of people saying that the Navajo servant of Pete Maxwell, Delavina Maxwell, was the first person into the room. Pat Garrett kills Billy the Kid, and they're all scared to go in, and Delavina says, you guys are all cowards. I'm going to get a lamp. I'm going to go into the dark room. And she goes in and says, Billy, Billy, don't shoot me. It's Delavina. And she goes in and she sees the body and she rolls it over and she goes, it's okay, everybody. Everybody can come in. And so everybody comes in and they tell this story. It's in the historians' books. And yet, there's a 1923 letter that Delavina herself wrote to a man named J. Everett Haley, where she says she wasn't there that night. She wasn't there until the next day, and that it was Pete Maxwell, the guy who owned the house, that went in to the room after Pat Garrett supposedly killed Billy the Kid. So again, when you look at the testimonies, it's not that there's minor discrepancies. There are major discrepancies. They can't even agree on who was there in this small town. Only had about 14 buildings and not very many residents. And so they say, oh, we were all there. There's all these people that saw the body. In reality, we don't know that anybody really saw the body besides Pat Garrett and maybe his deputies, but they had never seen Billy the Kid before, other than Pat Garrett, of course. You have a guy named Chuck McKinney in the 1980s who is literally the grandson. He's an Army officer. He's the grandson of Kip McKinney. And he lived with his grandmother for a time before she passed away. And he says that my grandma, Kip McKinney's wife, told me they didn't kill Billy the Kid that night. Then you have a daughter of Pat Garrett saying they didn't kill Billy the Kid that night. Then you have Eve Ball, who is a female historian of the Wild West, very noted historian of the Wild West, says she talked to Frank Coe's daughter, and she was present when her dad, Frank Coe, one of the regulators with Billy the Kid, talked to John Poe in a bank, because he became a banker, and said, what happened that night? And they said, we didn't kill the kid. We passed somebody else off as the kid to protect the reputation of a young woman. So you have all these descendants. So again, the critics will say, well, his own family said he wasn't Billy the Kid. One, that's not true, never happened. 2, the family members of the deputies involved in supposedly killing Billy the Kid all said their parents and grandparents didn't kill Billy the Kid. So again, it's an interesting story. So back in the late 80s, early 90s, Emilio Estevez came out with these movies, Young Guns 1 and Young Guns 2. And like many people, as I'm watching Young Guns 2, it starts out with an old man named Brushy Bill Roberts who claimed to be Billy the Kid. And I watched this movie, didn't think much about it until the end, where I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, I thought Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid. Why are they showing him as an old man? And so I did some research and found out that there was an old man who lived here in Hico who claimed to be Billy the Kid. But he didn't come out publicly. There was an attorney by the name of William Morrison who discovered him. And once he gained his trust, the old man said that he would like his help to get a pardon so he could die a free man. The lawyer took him in front of the governor of New Mexico, tried to secure the pardon. The governor didn't give him his pardon, and he died about 30 days later here in Hico. But he wrote a book about it in 1955 called Alias Billy the Kid. So I got an original copy of that book and I started doing research, and the rest is history. So Billy the Kid is a young man on the western frontier. To kind of add to his trouble, he looked younger than he actually was. So the big tough men, of course, this is after the Civil War, so you had a lot of really tough, violent people from the Civil War. You also had a lot of criminals that were in trouble back east, so they would flee to the west. And so you had a lot of really rough, rugged people going to the west. And in the middle of this, you have this young guy who looks like a 14-year-old boy. And for some reason, he was the baddest of them all. And not only could he hang with these guys, but he could shoot faster, shoot straighter, and they were scared of him. And so how do you have an individual like this that's so extraordinary that he could become a legend among those types of people? And so Billy the Kid, you know, it said that he was an outlaw. It was said that by the time he was 21 years old, he had killed 21 men. And he ended up being a part of what's called the Lincoln Cattle War, which is one of the big cattle wars between the landowners in New Mexico. And that was one of the reasons he was notable. But more notable is the fact that when he got on the wrong side of the law, he was arrested many times. And unexplainably, he had a way of escaping. And so he escaped 3 different times from law enforcement, again, while looking like a schoolboy and only about 160 pounds, maybe about 5 feet 8 inches tall, surrounded by all these law enforcement guys. And somehow he's able to escape from jail. And in the last instance where he escaped, he killed the 2 deputies that were watching over him. So this was a very unique individual. Billy the Kid, that was a time in his life where people called him the Kid because he was young. And yeah, if you go back to people that knew him then, you'd say, oh, it's the Kid, hey, what's up? But again, life back then was very local. It was very rural, it was very agrarian. And so you could leave and start a new life. And so Brushy Bill had done that literally in 1881 after Pat Garrett supposedly killed him. He escaped, he was wounded, he lived with the Yaqui Indians, he got a job driving a salt wagon. And then he went into the Spanish-American War. He said he served on the Anti-Horse Thief Association, Cuba. He said he had a Wild West show. So he just did whatever he could to earn a living. And he was on both sides of the law. And then he worked at a turkey processing plant as he got really old. A lot of Billy the Kid's people actually ended up here in Texas, not very far from here. So there's a lot of people from Texas and New Mexico that went back and forth. So it was not odd at all that Billy the Kid would come back to Texas. And that's an important point because Brushy Bill said he was born in Texas. And all the historians say he was born in New York City, except for who I think is the best historian, Fred Nolan, who is the authority on Billy the Kid. He passed away, unfortunately, but he's the guy that found the handwritten letters of John Tunstall, who had written them back to his family. That's Billy the Kid's boss. Fred Nolan found those letters and did a whole book on it. So Fred Nolan is among those who say Billy the Kid, there's no evidence he was ever born in New York. And yet what you have is you have a lot of very poor scholarship in the academic community where they'll take a family in Manhattan and say, oh, there's a Catherine Bonney, that must be Billy the Kid's mom. So he was born in New York, and here's evidence. Now, the problem with that is, one, it's not Catherine Bonney, it's Catherine McCarty, but it wasn't even McCarty. The census says McCarthy with an H. And they say, well, that's close enough, that must be Billy the Kid's mom. But then there's a sister, and Billy the Kid never had a sister. So there's all this really poor scholarship by these supposedly PhD academics that say Billy the Kid was born in New York, but Brushy Bill said he was born in Texas. And again, Frederick Nolan, the preeminent Billy the Kid historian, is very clear that there's no evidence he was born in New York, and I happen to agree with him. Among the many activities that he did. He was running up cattle in I think the Dakotas, and there was a lot of brush, and so he would run into the brush and go after him. I guess he didn't want to run into the brush because you get stuff all over you, and he was crazy. He didn't care. He would ride right into the brush, so they started calling him Brushy Bill. There have been stories where people say, oh, you know, I knew him in Hico, and he used to always tell people he was Billy the Kid. That's not true. He didn't want his wife to know that he had killed people. So he didn't want his wife to know that he was Billy the Kid, so he didn't tell anybody he was Billy the Kid. Matter of fact, he did a radio interview in 1948 supporting the guy who claimed to be Jesse James, and he could have come out then if he wanted publicity. So he didn't say anything about it. He said his father had known this guy as Jesse James, and he had known him as Jesse James, but he never came out as Billy the Kid. It was literally a private legal matter between him and his attorneys. Very prominent people. This was not a publicity stunt. This was not a hoax. This was a serious legal matter, literally about a death sentence. So it was very interesting. But he lived a quiet life here in Hico and would tell stories about, I used to ride horses and break horses, and I used to this and that, but he never talked about being Billy the Kid. When you think about Brushy Bill, you should also think about the nature of Billy the Kid. So here's a young man, supposedly an outlaw. They branded him an outlaw in the newspapers. And the governor of New Mexico said, we're going to give amnesty to everybody. Okay, it was a bad time in this country. It's all over. We just got to give amnesty to everybody, except for Billy the Kid. You're still guilty because you're the worst of them, and you're still guilty. So Billy the Kid was wanted when everyone else was let go. But Billy the Kid believed in law and order. He believed in the justice system. There's a number of times where he testified. He wrote to the governor and said, hey, I have information on corruption. I'll testify. There was a young lawyer who was a lawyer for Susan McSween, who was the wife of Alexander McSween, who was involved in the Lincoln County War and murdered by the Murphy-Dolan faction. And she hired a lawyer, and they murdered him in the streets of Lincoln. And Billy the Kid testified against the people that murdered Huston Chapman. So here's a young man that believes in law and order and goes in front of the courts to get the record straightened out. Now you fast forward to 1950, Brushy Bill Roberts wants to go to the governor, and he wants to straighten out the record. And he says, I want to die a free man. They've been telling all these lies about me. And then it became a legend in all the movies and TVs. And he says, I didn't do any of those things. I want to die a free man. You would think that if he was not Billy the Kid, that he would be trying to lay claim to some of the more legendary exploits that he was known for. But instead, he said he wasn't an outlaw, he never robbed banks or stagecoaches, and he talked more about his skill as a bronco buster than he did as a gunslinger. And then very importantly, when you look at the story of Brushy Bill Roberts, he literally went to the governor and asked for a pardon, not for being Billy the Kid, but he asked for a pardon for killing Sheriff William Brady, which is what Billy the Kid was actually convicted of and sentenced to hang. And so by claiming he was Billy the Kid, he was actually laying claim to an active death sentence that they could have very well executed him over. So yeah, we know today he wasn't arrested, he wasn't hanged, he got away, it wasn't that big of a deal. But back then, he didn't know that. And actually, if you look at the period newspapers, you will see that a lot of people, including the sheriff, were not only calling for Brushy Bill's arrest, but also for the arrest of his attorneys, because they were aiding and abetting a fugitive. Because originally, when he came out, the lawyers would not tell the governor who the guy was. They said, we have a guy that's Billy the Kid, he can prove he's Billy the Kid, but he's not going to come out unless you give him a pardon. And it was the governor that said, I got to meet this guy in person. And then when he did meet him in person, he turned it into a media circus and said, this guy's not Billy the Kid. But if you look at the primary evidence, all of the evidence is in favor that Brushy Bill Roberts of Hico, Texas was actually Billy the Kid. They set about trying to obtain evidence, which is another very important thing. They wanted to find people that knew Billy the Kid, they could identify him, and signed sworn affidavits that he was Billy the Kid. So they found a number of them. The most important one is probably Severo Gallegos, who was a 14-year-old boy who was in front of the Lincoln County Courthouse the day Billy the Kid escaped and killed the two guards. He knew him. He had a house in San Patricio. The Gallegoses lived in San Patricio, and they knew each other. It wasn't like they met for the first time. So Billy sees Severo under the tree, and he says, Severo, go get me that horse. Get me a rope so I can get this horse. Severo brings the rope, and Billy rides out of town. And Severo Gallegos signed a sworn affidavit that said, I haven't seen Billy the Kid since that day in 1881 when he escaped until today when I met Brushy Bill Roberts. This is the same guy that I knew in Lincoln, New Mexico. Very powerful witness testimony. And then there's other people that knew Brushy Bill Roberts as Billy the Kid that signed sworn affidavits. And when the governor had his meeting, he didn't invite any of those people. He invited everybody else, but the people that signed the sworn affidavits, the people that supported Brushy Bill's claim, he didn't even invite them to the hearing. So Brushy now, he had been betrayed by Lew Wallace. Lew Wallace said, if you testify, I'm going to give you a pardon. He testified and he didn't give him a pardon. And so now, again, he's now 90 years old. He's blindsided by, he's supposed to have a private meeting with the governor. One, he didn't want to meet the governor. The governor said, you have to, or I'm not going to pardon you. And the governor said, you know what? Don't come to my office because I don't want people to know. Come to my house. If you come to my house, we'll have a private meeting. Well, what Brushy Bill didn't know and what his lawyer didn't know, he set up a media circus at his house. So he literally had him come in through the kitchen entrance. And when he came in, Pat Garrett's kids were there, all these other historians were there, and they totally blindsided him, started taking pictures of him. And there were state troopers there, there was the sheriff of Carlsbad there, and he literally thought he was going to be arrested for the murder of Sheriff Brady. And so he had a stroke. He had a stroke it's called a transient ischemic attack, where he had a heart blockage. So your heart can't pump enough blood, so you get dizzy because your heart rate goes up and you just can't process. So you kind of swoon, and he had to lay down in the governor's study for about 20 minutes. After that, his heart rate comes down. He's starting to feel a little bit better. He comes out, and they start firing a bunch of questions, stupid questions like, how many girlfriends did you have? Nothing about, he could actually slip handcuffs, which is very unusual. He had all the physical characteristics of Billy the Kid. He knew intimate details of the Lincoln County War. He knew the geography of Fort Sumner and everywhere. He knew the people. Sally Chisholm, for example, was not John Chisholm's daughter. It was his niece. He knew that. And so nobody asked him any of that stuff. They just asked him a bunch of stupid questions. And then the governor comes out and says, I'm not going to give this guy a pardon. I don't think he's Billy the Kid. But apparently he actually told Morrison, the lawyer, let me get back to you guys. Let me consider all this stuff. I'll get back to you. And then afterwards, he told the reporters what to write. So you can actually look at the newspapers before the meeting and after the meeting, and it's a very different vibe in the papers, a different story. I have the private letters of Mr. Morrison from his family that they gave me, and there's correspondence where he says, we're going to get more evidence. He had his buck teeth. Billy Kid had buck teeth. So he had his buck teeth in his trunk. And he goes, I want to get a dental imprint made of those. We're going to prove that you're Billy the Kid. We're going to do everything we can, handwriting experts, everything. So this was not a fraud or a hoax. This was somebody, whether he was right or wrong, it was a serious effort to find the truth. In his dialogue with Mr. Morrison, he said that he was in the bunch that captured Crazy Snake, the Indian. And I'm reading that and saying, who's Crazy Snake? I don't know who Crazy Snake is. But apparently in the Wild West, there was a smoked meat rebellion where the Indians weren't getting enough smoked meat, so they rebelled. The guy that led the rebellion is a guy named Crazy Snake. And Brushy Bill said he was a U.S. Marshal. They're chasing this guy for a long period of time. There's dozens and dozens of people, different posses. Eventually, they capture him, and there's only 5 people in the posse that captured Crazy Snake. So Brushy Bill says, I was in the bunch that captured Crazy Snake. And there's only one U.S. Marshal. The U.S. Marshal that was in the bunch that captured Crazy Snake was not William H. Roberts or William H. Bonney. It was William H. Carr. So I started investigating the life of William H. Carr. Come to find out, he was known to be an associate of outlaws. He was on both sides of the law, and yet there's no real record of him. He did all the things that Brushy Bill said he did. He's got the first initial, second initial, but a different last name. And so I think that's probably Brushy Bill doing exactly what he said he was going to do as a U.S. Marshal in Indian Territory. Also, one of the photos we have, there's a famous photo of Bass Reeves, a famous U.S. Marshal. Brushy Bill has the exact same photo where he's wearing a coin U.S. Marshal's badge. So I mean, why would this guy, Ollie Roberts, be wearing a U.S. Marshal's badge if he's not a U.S. Marshal? We know a lot of those things, but there's things we don't know that we're still investigating. Like he says he went to Mexico for a number of years. He fought in the Mexican Revolution with Pancho Villa. I've done a lot of research into this. There are people that said they saw him. Manuel Taylor is a very prominent businessman. He said he saw Billy the Kid in Guadalajara, Mexico. I think it was around 1901, 1902. And then there's also the stories he told about using Winchester 1894 rifles against the Mexicans when they had the long guns. So he just tells a story about how a small number of Americans was able to fight off a larger group of Mexicans. And that makes sense because they had lever action rifles, which was a huge leap forward in ballistic technology at the time. I mean, you could now work the lever on your Winchester and fire, 7 shots or whatever versus the bolt action guys that had to reload and whatever. So there's little things like that where you can tell that Brushy Bill was clearly a fighting man that understood the ballistics and things of his time. He talked about how he carried a 44-40 single action because when he shot somebody, he wanted to make sure they went down and stayed down. Mr. Morrison wrote a book on Pancho Villa, and I've read it. He interviewed the assassin. It's on YouTube. I put it on YouTube. He interviews one of the assassins of Pancho Villa. So Mr. Morrison was pursuing the whole Billy the Kid, Pancho Villa angle. But every time you get into it, you do get something. You do. It never contradicts it to where like, this is all fake. This is all. It just proved that it's wrong. You always get something that's like, wow, that actually supports what he said. It's never the opposite so far. He stole the identity of a man named Oliver Pleasant Roberts. And first of all, there's photos of Brushy, and you can date the photo based on the clothing he was wearing. And the photos very clearly date from 1887 to 1891. He's a full-grown man. He's 27 years old in these photos. And Oliver Roberts, who's the man's identity that he stole, would have been 8 years old. And so obviously he's not Oliver Roberts. People try to make a lot of the census records for Oliver, say, well, he's only 8 years old. How could he be Billy the Kid? Or 2 years old when Billy the Kid was killed. How could he be Billy the Kid? But obviously, if I use your ID to go buy beer, it doesn't change my birth date, right? I'm using your ID, it's your birth date, my birth date doesn't change. So anyway, this guy, Oliver Roberts, he used his identity, but yet he went by Billy. Why would a guy named Oliver go by Billy? It doesn't, because it was just an identity he used to hide. In one of Brushy's last letters to Mr. Morrison, he says, I want to tell you how I got the name Bonnie. Now, early in their dialogue, when he wasn't sure if he could trust Mr. Morrison, he was still laying out false information. And he said that Catherine Bonnie was not his mom, it was his aunt. And he had run away from home and he had lived with his aunt in Silver City. Well, there's never been any genealogical connection for Catherine Antrim, who was married to William Antrim in Silver City, Billy the Kid's quote-unquote mom, and anybody named Bonnie. And Mr. Morrison says, don't worry, I'm going to come to town with a tape recorder. You can tell me all about it. But Brushy knew he was not going to be here long. I don't know if he knew he was going to die, but he wasn't feeling very good. So he literally sends him a second letter and says, Belle Starr gave me the name Bonnie. It's my outlaw name. And so she wanted him to be an outlaw. He didn't want to be an outlaw, so he left. He was at her camp. He was a little younger guy, and he would blow the trumpet. So if you see a rider, you blow one trumpet. You see two riders, you blow two trumpets, or three. So nowhere in history did anybody ever know that Belle Starr gave Billy the Kid the name Bonnie, and that it was his outlaw name. Only Brushy Bill said that. Now, was it true? I think it was, because again, there's no record anywhere of Bonnie. So that solves the mystery of the name Bonnie in regards to Billy the Kid. And I think that's stuff like that is, why would he say that? Like before he dies, like he wanted that to be out there, that I got to tell you the truth about where the name Bonnie came from. Stuff like that is really cool, that Brushy Bill, and there's a bunch of stuff like that he knew about the life of Billy the Kid. He comes back to Hico, he's in bed for about a month, and another thing, he wouldn't talk to the newspapers. So again, people say, well, he wanted to be famous, he wanted publicity, he's a crazy old man, but he didn't talk to the newspapers. They're all lined up at his house here in Hico, and they were trying to shame him, saying, well, you gave interviews to all those reporters, and he said, no, I didn't. They blindsided me. I didn't invite him to be there, so I didn't give anybody an interview. And then about December 27th, so the meeting was on November 30th, about a month later, his wife says, do you feel well enough to walk down and mail a letter for me? And he might have been mailing the letter to Mr. Morrison, I don't know. And so he's walking here on the street in Hico, and he has a heart attack. And so he falls across a bumper of a car with his arm up, and he goes to the great big roundup in the sky and dies a free man, which is what he wanted. So I think that's pretty cool. So I've heard a lot of people say, why is it so hard to find a definitive answer to whether or not Brushy Bill Roberts was Billy the Kid or not? And my point of view would be that I don't think it is. I think the evidence pretty much at this point has proven that Brushy Bill more than likely was Billy the Kid. And I always phrase it that way for academic integrity because I don't know if he was Billy the Kid. It certainly seems that way from all of the evidence. And the biggest thing to me when I started the research was, you find out everything's a lie. You find out that literally all the things they said about Brushy Bill Roberts is a lie. All the arguments, his own family said he wasn't Billy the Kid. Not true. His wife, who lived right here in Hico, thought he was Billy the Kid once she found out. There's a lot of things that just aren't true, and obviously on their face aren't true. And then the things that are very strong evidences, like Severo Gallegos and his affidavit, they try to rationalize that away like it was not credible or something. And then you look at, again, Mr. Morrison, they'll say, oh, he wanted to be famous, he wanted this. And you do the research and you find out that the University of New Mexico Press published his book, and that C.L. Sonneson, who is the president of the Western Writers of America, co-authored the book. And it was peer-reviewed by the university. And they say in the foreword to the book that we don't know if this is true or not, but we believe it's an honest effort. And so the reality, when you look at the historical record, is never, ever, ever what they say it is. And so you just have to go do your own research. But it's amazing how people will lie. I mean, they'll straight up lie to your face. I mean, the information's in the public record. I think the public actually does believe that Brushy Bill Roberts, in the main, they think that Brushy Bill Roberts probably was Billy the Kid. The only time I really bump into people that are fanatical that say, no, he wasn't, they're usually part of a community, the roadside museum type people. That they don't have an interest in solving the truth. But I do genuinely believe that the evidence pretty dang close to being settled. And of course, I did a documentary with Emilio Estevez on a photo that was discovered in Canada. So a Canadian couple brings me this photo. They say, we think we have a photo of Billy the Kid. I say, you don't, okay? And not to be a jerk, but you don't. There's no way, even if you do, there's no way to prove it, because everybody thinks they have a photo of Billy the Kid. And even if it looks like Billy the Kid, people look alike, so it doesn't prove anything. And they said, no, we have Billy the Kid, and we have Catherine McCarty, Bonnie, and we have William Antrim. So I look at the photo, they're in a mine, and as soon as I see the guy, I said, that looks like Brushy Bill. It looks like Billy the Kid to me. And so then I look at the lady, who's supposedly Catherine Antrim. I said, that sure does look like the photo of Catherine Antrim. However, the photo of Catherine Antrim is not Catherine Antrim. The guy originally who had that was the guy that owned the theater in Silver City. And he sold it as a photo of Catherine Antrim, Billy the Kid's mother. Later, when it became famous, he said, no, that's really not her. I forget who that is, but it's not Catherine Antrim. But the lady in this photo from Canada was the same lady. So it's like, who is this mysterious lady that's with this guy who looks like Billy the Kid? Then there was another guy who was a minor guy. I did some comparisons and did some research, and Catherine Bonnie, or Antrim, died in 1874, and based on the date of the photo, it couldn't have been her. And then the guy was too short to be William Antrim, Billy the Kid's stepfather. But I was really compelled by this photo, and they continued to do research, and we made the connection that it's Levi and Maggie Miller from the area of Canada where this photo was found. She took this photo with Billy the Kid, mailed it back to her family, wrote Billy the Kid on it, mailed it back to her family, and it stayed there for generations until it was discovered a few years ago. And so I took that photo to the NYPD, Facial Recognition Unit. A lot of the detectives there looked at it. One in particular who was willing to talk to me about it was Detective Michael Furia. He looked at the photo, and I didn't tell him who I thought it was. I said, I have do some genealogy here, and I have some old photos. Would you tell me if these are the same people? And I didn't want to take the risk that he had seen the famous photo of Billy the Kid. And so I gave him pictures of Brushy Bill Roberts at different times in his life. And he came back definitively and said, that's the same person. It's either him or an identical twin. The lady, he said, that's definitely Maggie Miller. It's definitely the same person. Using all the techniques that they use on a daily basis to recommend people be arrested, he's saying that's them. I think the vast majority, from the feedback I've gotten, the vast majority does not believe that Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid. And the vast majority believes that Brushy Bill pretty much was probably Billy the Kid. In the critics, they've literally got nothing. There's nothing. Like, give me something. It's the same arguments. He doesn't look anything like him. It's like, we just settled that. We literally just settled that. How could you keep saying it when we literally just settled it? He was only 2 years old. No, he wasn't. And not only do we have photos of him, again, he's fully grown in the 1880s, but if you look at the census records, in 1890, he didn't know how to read or write, but then in 1910, he does. So there's anomalies in the historical record that support that he stole somebody's identity. So the evidence is overwhelming, and if you're not going to consider all these things, then what's the point of looking for evidence? We'll just say, no, it's an objective fact that the Cowboys are better than the Philadelphia Eagles. You're never going to get anybody to agree to that. I find the relationship between New Mexico and Hico interesting because, Billy the Kid was all over. He was in Santa Fe, he was in Lincoln, he was in Fort Sumner, and he obviously went other places as well, right? So supposedly he was born in New York, so why isn't New York part of the fight, Really what you get down to is communities, my dad's bigger than your dad, my football team is better than your football team, you stink, we're great. It's perpetuated mainly by the roadside museum people. They're a little bit more inclined to make stuff up. And so what I like about this museum is they don't do that. They put the facts out for people to evaluate and make up their own mind. But you do have the giant, biggest ball of twine. Those old roadside museum attractions of the 70s and 80s, like we were in Death Valley and we saw the world's largest thermometer, so it's like, and then there's like the biggest knife store, and is it, or is the one down the street that says it's the biggest knife store, like the biggest knife store? Like there's not a lot, it's a lot of showmanship, the P.T. Barnum kind of just, it's entertainment, and that's fine. And I think what confuses the story a little bit is some of the 1970s, 1980s factions that were really roadside museum factions vying for tourists confuse the issue. So I would say this to anybody interested in the story of Brushy Bill Roberts or Billy the Kid. First of all, you got to come see Billy's last hideout. I mean, you just have to. You have to see the town. He walked the streets. The buildings are still kind of the same as they were back then. There's a really cool fountain at the end of the street where you water your horse. I've never seen that in any town anywhere in America. And so you really have a time capsule here in Hico. Now you can still get the great food and you can still get the great shopping and you can still get all that. But you got to come and see where it all ended for Billy the Kid, but also kind of where it began. To me, that line, I wasn't an outlaw, I never robbed banks or stagecoaches, I want to die a free man. What a story of redemption, a guy who wasn't perfect, killed people, stole cattle, but was really active in one of the most intriguing periods of American history and was notable in the period of American history. And no one has ever really heard his story from him. You've heard a lot of people talk about it, but if Brushy Bill Roberts was Billy the Kid, you can actually hear Billy the Kid's story from Billy the Kid. How cool is that? And so it at least deserves to be looked at and considered. And I think that's going to continue to happen for another 140 years, or as long as there's people interested in the Wild West.